Right, let's carry on. I'd now like to introduce you to a chap called Mr. John L. Casey. John lives in Orlando, America. I've been corresponding with John a fair bit on this subject because I've given similar presentations at work. John used to work for NASA. He's now retired from that job, or semi-retired from that job. He was an advisor to the White House about 15, 20 years ago on NASA science, and John, because of his credentials, his scientific background and his engineering background, was selected to investigate the Challenger space shuttle disaster, which blew up on takeoff. And John headed the team that investigated that incident, and he was chosen because of his rigorous analysis of data and evidence and his ability to spot trends. And he was successfully identified with his team the cause of that accident. When John semi-retired from NASA and advising the White House, he had a bit more time on his hand, and he had time to look at the data on a particular subject which interested him, which was climate change. John, for many years, believed, like everyone else, that CO2 drove global temperature. It seemed a logical theory, but John decided to look at the data. And over a period of time of rigorously analysing the data, he came to the same conclusion that CO2 does not drive global temperature. There are far bigger drivers of global temperature, namely the sun and the cycles it goes through. If we could have the lights down, please.
Hello and welcome to Newsmax TV. I'm John Bachman. Joining us right now from Orlando, Florida is John L. Casey. He's the president of the Space and Science Research Center and a former White House Space Program advisor and NASA consultant. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
All right, so much of the U.S. is still digging out of or thawing out from this so-called polar vortex, but according to a recent op-ed that you wrote, which appeared in the Orlando Sentinel, people might want to get used to this kind of weather.
Absolutely. I think the research we've published and is well recognized by others around the world shows that we're heading into a long, cold climate era, so we should get prepared for this kind of thing.
Well, as simply as you can, explain these sun cycles and what is so important, particularly about 2014.
If one looks at solar cycles as indicators of climate change, you'll find several things. Number one, they're extremely reliable when it comes to predicting climate variation. This compares with the greenhouse gas theory that we've heard so much about from the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for 20 years now. Unfortunately, their models are very poorly reflected in the data. They simply don't work. And what we've realized now is that the mankind's CO2 production has really very small impact, if any, on climate change. It's really the sun that causes climate change, and that's what we're working toward, is predicting the next climate change based on solar models. And these show us clearly that we're heading into decades of cold climate. Our Russian colleagues have picked out 2014 as the year when, in fact, they say a little ice age will begin. We don't think it's going to be quite that severe as yet, but certainly cold enough to give us concern for the next 2 decades.
And explain for us what that looks like. I mean, even if we're not going to use the term little ice age, what does a significant cooling event look like for food production? What does it look like for the way that we travel? What does it look like for humankind as a whole?
If one looks at the history, and we're working off a 206-year solar cycle, it is simply repeating as it often does. If we go back to the last time we had this cool era, which we call a solar hibernation, that was from 1793 to 1830, roughly. And during that period, the cold was so severe and crop damage globally so bad that many people starved and froze to death. Historian John D. Post called it the humankind's worst subsistence crisis ever recorded.
This kind of all goes back about 7 years when you were an advisor to the White House and you first brought forth your findings on this global cooling phenomenon, you say that you faced some attacks. You were ridiculed and even slandered. What was that like for you?
Well, first off, I knew that was coming. If one looks at the history of science, anytime someone stands up to the dogma of the day, they get attacked, whether it be in a science field or a political field or a medical field, doesn't matter. If you're a lone wolf and saying something that's basically opposite of what the rest of the community is saying, you're going to be attacked. So I knew that was coming. And when I announced to the White House, the mainstream media, and government agencies and the scientific community my predictions for climate, that was even more so an opportunity to attack me. Regardless of my space program credentials, I had none in climatology, so I was kind of the new kid on the block and open for attack.
And you said you expected that because there are so many people who are on the other side of this argument that are just so absolutely certain that you are wrong. And folks who question man-made global warming, these folks just have it made up in their minds 100% that y'all are wrong. What do you think is going to change those people's minds?
Well, it's going to be difficult for them. I know it was very difficult for me back in March and April of 2007 when I completed my solar physics research, determined a particular 206-year cycle of the sun that was ending global warming and now was going to start global cooling. It was difficult, so I expect it will be difficult for many people. Realistically, we've had 23, 25 years of propaganda about mankind causing climate change because of greenhouse gases. So if that's all one hears for 20, 25 years, you would expect people to pretty much accept that approach. So until things really change, it's going to be difficult.
Okay, so that's John Casey, and I urge you to go onto YouTube and watch he's given many presentations on this subject, and they're really good, and he presents in a very, very clear manner. But there's many John Caseys all over the world. There's many scientists like that. And what's really interesting is as these scientists are starting to retire, more and more of them are coming out saying, well, hang on a minute, we think we've got things wrong here. There are greater drivers of the climate, namely solar cycles. In fact, people that were in employment, and there's billions of dollars being poured in to CO2-based climate research. If people did suggest an alternative, quite often they would be removed from their positions. And some even lost their jobs. And they certainly lost any grants towards climate research. That's how controlled this environment is. Okay then, so back to our theory. And if predictions in particular are supported by the evidence, then you know you're onto a good theory. Prediction number one of the solar cycle theory, this is the sun changing our climate. It was predicted back in 2007 that temperatures would plateau. And it's happened. There's been a plateau in world temperatures. We've recently, you'll hear in the news that this year and last year are the highest temperatures on record globally. And they are high because of an El Nino. And it's a known phenomenon. Back in 1997, it was an El Nino year. It's a known phenomenon where the Pacific Ocean releases a lot of heat into the atmosphere. So don't be distracted, don't be persuaded that something significant has happened in the last couple of years, because it's happened many times before in El Nino years. It was predicted with the solar cycle theory that the oceans would start to cooling, and the majority of the oceans have entered a cooling phase. The oceans too follow a cyclic path of getting warmer and cooler. Most of the oceans are now falling into a cooling phase, predicted by the solar cycle theory. Some oceans are not. Some oceans are still increasing in temperature. The majority are cooling. 75% of the Earth's surface is ocean. Generally, where the oceans go with temperature, the climate follows. It was predicted that a new cold climate would envelop the Earth during solar cycles 25 and 26. This roughly 200-year cycle would repeat itself. And the next two solar cycles of sun activity will be extremely low. It's one we've got to wait and see on. If we go back 400 years, where we've got credible, reliable data on solar activity, because it was recorded, we can see that, go back 200 years, we had the Dalton minimum. Very, very difficult time in human history because of the cold. And we go back another 200 years and we see the start of the Maunder minimum. Now, most scientists are going for a repeat event of 200 years, which is the Dalton minimum. That will be bad enough. The Russians, and by the way, the Russian scientists can speak very openly and very freely about solar cycles and climate. More on that in a little bit. They're going for another Maunder minimum. If we have a Maunder minimum over the next few decades, then, as one scientist put it, the loss of life will be biblical in volume. Dalton minimum will be bad enough. Let's hope this doesn't happen. We won't know till about another 4 or 5 years when solar cycle 25 starts. If it fails to start, we're back into a Maunder minimum. Right, okay. It was predicted that solar cycle 24 that we're just coming out of would be significantly less than the previous solar cycle as the sun goes into what was called hibernation. It doesn't shut down, but it goes quiet. Not that you would notice it outside, but the solar activity on the surface goes quiet. A solar cycle, John in particular predicted a peak of 74 sunspots at solar maximum. NASA and various other bodies were going for a repeat of 23, and it ended up being about half. To some solar climate people, that was quite a shock. But John was spot on with that one. Now, this is where it starts to get really interesting. There is another head to this coming cold period. It's a two-headed beast, if you like, in that if you go back in history, when we've had these solar minimums before, there is an increase in seismic activity, a significant increase in seismic activity, earthquakes, volcanoes, for reasons that aren't fully understood, but history shows us, because these cycles are so regular, and the data would seem to support it. Since about 2000, there's been a significant increase in the number of sizable earthquakes. That's magnitude 6 and above. There's an earthquake, again, recently, wasn't there, in New Zealand? I think there was an email about it on the Winton thing. Haven't read it yet. So there's been a significant increase over the last 100 years in seismic activity. That is also repeated in volcanic activity. A significant increase over the last 100 years. In fact, no, that's going back 400 years. And there's been a clear correlation that whenever you've had this solar hibernation type period, some of the biggest volcano eruptions have happened. Back in the 1800s, which we believe is going to be a similar event to what we're going into, Tambora went up. And that's the biggest volcanic eruption in recent history, recorded history. The core, or the effect of that eruption, was in 1812. It was known as the year without a summer. Total crop failure across the globe because of the dust in the atmosphere. When they go back further, and they can, again, this volcanic dust they can find in ice core data and sediment data and all sorts, follows this pattern. When you have low solar activity, solar hibernation, you get severe earthquakes and volcanic activity. It was predicted that the decline in Arctic sea ice, which was at its worst in 2012, had ended the decline, and now a new long-term growth trend has started, and that has been so far validated. 2012 was the lowest, and ever since it started to increase. It's predicted that the oceans were cooling, and in particular, the North Atlantic Ocean is now gone into a cooling phase. It was predicted that global sea rises would begin to decline somewhere between 2014 and 2020. As the oceans cool, sea level rise will change. It will plateau out and then start declining. To wait and see on that one. So there's evidence seems to support the theories. So what are the predictions? This is where it really starts to get interesting. The predictions are due to solar cycles that have happened many times before, roughly over a 200-year cycle. So there's lots of evidence that supports that cycle, that this will happen. We will go into a cooling phase over the next 2 solar cycles, which will take us through to about 2040. I say peak at 2030, it really bottoms out at 2030. And either side of it, roughly sort of 10 years, we will have a very cold climate. Okay, so by far the biggest impact will be on global food production. It will be greatly reduced. If we have another Tambora in this period, it will be wiped out possibly for 1 to 2 years completely. You just won't, it'll be so cold, you just won't be able to grow the crops. If we don't have a major volcanic event, then even so, the growing season will be reduced dramatically. That in turn will result in massive increases in food prices. Wheat is in everything. If you're celiac, then you'll know wheat's pretty much in everything. So expect not only wheat crops to fail, but all sorts of crops to fail and harvests to fail because of the cold. Not only the cold, it will be wetter as well. Again, it's a repeat cycle. You only have to look at history back in the 1800s to see what happened, and the 1600s, how it affected food production. There'll be shorter growing seasons and a lot longer winters, particularly the springs will be long and cold. Because of that, they won't be able to get the crops in the field because they'll be wet and cold. You end up with a growing season that isn't long enough to grow crops for them to ripen and harvest. Colder temperatures for long periods, stuck wavy jet streams. Remember the jet stream, waves all over the place? Remember the phrase polar vortex? Heard a lot of that recently? In America particularly, this sudden pool of Arctic air plunges down over America, and it's happened in 2010 here. It happened a couple of years ago, 2014, in Eastern Europe. That will become the trend over winters. You'll still occasionally get mild winters, but it's not all bad news. Again, the jet stream will get stuck in certain places, and Eastern Europe and Asia will get walloped with a severe winter, and Western Europe will have a warmer air coming up. You'll also get stronger storms and flooding. Some of the strongest storms on record have been in the 1800s in this period and other periods. Because of the wavy jet stream, you get more mixing of equator warmth, tropical warmth, and polar air, where you get those significant differences in temperature, you tend to get more active weather, more rain. At the same time, you'll continue to see a substantial increase in earthquakes and volcanoes as we go into this period. Because of the food problems and the fact certain areas of the world have become very difficult to grow food, the way we grow food at the moment, you'll have events where America, for example, or Canada, will announce to the global food markets that this year, because their crop yields have been so low because of the poor weather, they will not be able to export crop, grain and wheat to the rest of the world. And that will send shockwaves across the world, and there'll be panic because no one will be expecting it. We've got used to a very reliable logistical infrastructure that delivers our food. We're not expecting things to run out. Because of that, we've streamlined our field-to-shelf process so much, it's almost next day from the field or the ocean to the supermarket. There are no stores, very few stores of food, because storing food costs money. From 2020 onwards, substantial crop failures. So we've got a bit of time and higher prices. As you get on to sort of the mid-20s and late 20s, then we'll start to get really severe crop failures. They will become the norm. Occasionally, you'll have a year where you'll have a good harvest, and things may settle, perhaps. Not likely, though. 2025 onwards, brutal winters will be the trend. Occasionally, some years, total crop failures, a substantial loss of life. As always, with these global problems, it's the poorest that are affected the most, and particularly the third world countries that rely heavily on grain food aid from other countries. So that will lead to famine. And if history repeats itself like it has done before, in this era, that often leads to war. This is a picture of what happened in the Maunder Minimum back in the 1600s, where the Thames used to freeze over. And it all looks quite cheery, really, doesn't it? People out there having fun and all the rest of it. And there were frost fairs on the Thames, etc. We're not expecting winters to be that brutal, but if the Russians are right, it will be that bad. However, that's a very false image of what happened at the time. For most people, this was it. This was it. Food was very hard to get hold of. It was very cold, and people really struggled, and a lot of people perished. A lot of people perished. Now, when the Bible says there'll be a time that never has been before, what's the difference now then, if this has happened before in human history? Well, the difference is, last time this happened in the 1800s, and before that the 1600s, there was about, best estimate, 1 billion people on the planet. There are now 7.5 billion people on this planet, and they all need feeding. And most of what they eat doesn't come locally. People, in fact, were more resilient back in those days. People were used to growing their own food. People were used to adapting to troublesome harvests and things. And yet still there was substantial loss of life. Yes, we've got technology, we've got medicine to help us, but only if we're informed of what's coming. And most of the world aren't at the moment. So, Russians are going for a Maunder Minimum. Most solar cycle scientists are going for the Dalton minimum. So what can we do? What can we do? Is it right to do something? Is it right to prepare? I want to make absolutely clear, when I put up on the screen what preparations we can do, we do not prepare to save ourselves, we prepare to save others. And there's a good biblical precedent for that, which we'll come on to. What can we do? Namely, for number one, spiritual preparation. It's going to be a tough time. A lot of people are going to question what on earth is going on in this world. Why is this being allowed to happen? The time for spiritual preparation is now. Pray for wisdom and guidance in these things. Even if we were to think we could save ourselves and protect ourselves by our own efforts, chances are, if things get really bad, that isn't going to happen anyway. I encourage you, as I've said along, to do your own research. I'm not expecting people to just suddenly think, oh, well, the CO2 out the window, cold era coming, sun's going into hibernation, and crack on. I'm not expecting that. It took me quite a while. But the only way to really convince yourself is do your own research, and the media are relying on you not doing that at the moment. Now, this is quite a biggie. I've always been quite reluctant to say this because it can be quite alarming. Incidentally, the Mormon faith have been doing this for decades because they expect at some point world events to suddenly become very stressful and difficult. So the Mormons have been keeping a year's food supply for quite some time. The reason why I think this is good advice, and this comes, again, this isn't my advice, this comes from scientists that have been investigating this, is because when these food shocks happen, there will be sudden panics. The supermarkets will be empty overnight because people will think, we're going to run out of food. You see it before hurricanes, don't you, and other events, immediately after earthquakes. Everyone's first place they go is straight into the supermarkets and clear the shelves out. There are no stores elsewhere in the UK. It's all shipped to shelf from the producers. So there'll be a delay. Could be days, could be weeks before supermarkets are reached. So you'll need to tap into your food supply. You don't suddenly have to go and rush out and buy a year's worth of food. I strongly don't recommend that. Far better on a monthly basis to buy a bit more than usual. Buy stuff that you would normally eat. Don't go buying bucket loads of rice if you don't like rice. Buy stuff you would normally eat. Otherwise you'll end up throwing it away. We've got some years, hopefully, before things really start to bite. There's good economic reasons for doing this anyway, whether you believe any of this or not. Because food prices are going up, because the world population is going up. So even just for economic reasons, buy food now, a year later, you can almost guarantee it'll be cheaper now than in a year's time. Don't forget water. That's quite important. You don't have to have a year's supply of water. That's a lot of water. But some water, drinking water. Again, for these shocks where suddenly people panic and things become very uncontrolled. Learn to grow your own food. Society doesn't seem to want to do this anymore on the scale it used to be back in the 1800s. It's not easy, actually, growing your own food. It's particularly not easy growing food for a colder climate. So you need to do research, find out what does well in a colder climate, mainly root vegetables. But now is the time to do this sort of preparation. Not on a large scale, just experiment. Just get familiar with what works, what doesn't work. And share the knowledge. Foraging is another way. You'll be surprised what's out there in the natural environment that you can eat. But it needs education, it needs investigation. We can't wait until we get to a stage where food is so expensive we wish we could grow our own food. Another advice coming from a lot of the scientists is reduce personal debt. We're talking about personal debt, credit cards, car loans, things like that. We're not talking about mortgages, we're not talking about student loans, government sort of schemes and things like that. The people, if things get really bad, that will come after you are the people with personal loans and credit card loans. They will want their money. Okay. Have a secondary heat source in your house. I work in the energy industry sector. Thank you. I can tell you with a great amount of confidence that our margin of spare capacity in the energy sector is next to zero. Officially, it's 2%. Before privatisation, it was about 20%. Nobody likes to pay for spare capacity. What that means is if we get a severe cold winter, high pressure sitting over Scandinavia, throwing easterly winds at us, snow from time to time, the renewable energies that you and I, as the taxpayer, have invested in heavily will not perform. That means our electricity infrastructure will be stretched to the absolute limit. In a winter period where there's a shortfall, you have to rely on gas turbines. Believe it or not, you will have to rely on gas for your electricity. Most of that gas is imported. When the continent wake up to the fact that this is happening on a regular basis, what do you think is going to happen? Have a secondary heat source in your house. Could be an open fire, could be a gas stove, just something, because at the worst time of year, when it's the coldest, that is when it's going to happen. And it may be a few days, a few weeks, before things are back online, because of the domino effect. From 2020, do not be too concerned about this yet, because this date could change. But at some point, it is recommended for those that live in high urban areas, cities, large towns, to arrange a rural place of sanctuary. Again, you only have to look at history to see what happened the last time when society broke down. When people are hungry and cold and their children are hungry and there's no food in the shops, things go downhill very quickly. When people hear you have food, you'll become an immediate attraction to people. It will become very dangerous at certain times in large urban areas. Arrange a place of sanctuary that you can go to. It may be a friend, it may be a relative, it may be somebody you know, somebody in our community that live in a rural area that you can go to, maybe just for a short time, until, again, the government can get control of things. But don't be too concerned about that yet, because that may be a number of years off from that 2020, but one to have in the back of your mind. Right, okay, so lots of warnings there, lots of preparations. What's the Bible got to say about this? And time really is marching on, but this is really important. The Magog invasion, Bible prophecy, Ezekiel 38:39, one of the massive events to take place concerning Israel, future, still to happen. We have this invasion, particularly from a northern confederacy of nations, most likely Russia, Turkey, Iran, Syria, other nations joining in. They invade Israel. This is where it starts to get really interesting. The Bible says, God says, I will turn you around, these northern nations. I will put hooks in your jaws and bring you out with your whole army. They'll be dragged down. They don't want to come, particularly. They'll be forced down. Why is that? Why is that? What's the motive? You will say, I will invade a land of unwalled villages. I will attack a peaceful and unsuspecting people, all of them living without walls and without gates and bars. I will plunder and loot. Turn my hand against the resettled ruins and the people gathered from the nations. This is Israel, rich in livestock and goods, living at the centre of the land. Plunder and loot, that's the motive. Interesting. This map is of Europe and Asia, and the dark blue are the most productive crop areas. Many of them lying in southern Russia and eastern Europe. The lighter colours, yellows and ultimately leading into reds, are low productive areas. So in this region of the world, the big producers are Russia and Eastern Europe. When this cold cycle hits, the latitude line of the Earth, of where you can grow crops, will move south about 500 miles. In late 20s, early 30s, you will not be able to grow food above this line. It will be too cold. It's reliable data that they've got from the 1800s when this has happened before. It's a cycle. What do you think Russia's going to do when it can't grow its food? This is quite interesting. These are the top 10 wheat producing countries, and of course we'd expect to see Russia, Canada, USA, China. Oh look what's in the middle there. Ukraine, Turkey, Iran. Has Russia been showing a lot of interest in Ukraine recently? Russian scientists are allowed to speak very freely about solar cycles. A prominent Russian scientist, Valkony, has come up with a new understanding of how the sun works and the dynamo within the sun, and she's very much on board that we're going to go into a Maunder minimum, a severe cold period. Interesting, isn't it, how Russia's showing a lot of interest in Ukraine, one of the bread baskets of the world. What about Crimea, that Russia took very secretly and cunningly, shall we say, and the world's, the rest of the world said, what's going on here? Crimea has a warm water port. It is expected in the coming cold era that the Baltic Sea up here, for large periods of the year, will freeze over, just in here. One of Russia's main naval ports is here. Can't remember what it's called, anybody know? Crimea has a massive port that Russia now occupies, and it has warm water access to the Mediterranean. Can't prove it, but it's really interesting, isn't it? Really interesting. Okay. Warnings from Jesus. There will be signs in the sun, moon and stars. All of those have a part to play in the solar cycles that have happened roughly every 200 years. In fact, one theory is why the sun does this every 200 years is because every 200 years, all the planets in our solar system fall into a similar sort of quadrant of rotation around the sun. And the theory is that they affect the way the sun behaves because of the gravitational forces. Many of those planets are a lot larger than the Earth and heavier than the Earth. A theory, but interesting, isn't it? What about food prices rocketing then? Is there any support for that? Well, if we go into Revelation, which talks about this end time period, particularly the last 7 years of Daniel's prophecy, then I heard what sounded like a voice among 4 living creatures saying, "A kilogram of wheat for a day's wages. 3 kilograms of barley for a day's wages. Do not damage the oil and wine." Food will become precious. It will become limited, in short supply. All to happen in these end time periods. For then there will be great distress, unequalled from the beginning of the world until now, never to be equalled again. 7.5 billion people on the planet. Most of them rely on food, third world countries rely on food handouts. Areas of the world, particularly Russia, will not be able to grow its own food anymore. Let's have a little bit more closer look at Matthew 24, what Jesus was talking about. Jesus answered, "Watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, claiming, 'I am the Messiah,' and will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumours of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places." Jesus links the two. Famines and earthquakes. All these things are the beginning of birth pains. Then you'll be handed over to be persecuted, put to death. You'll be hated by all nations because of me. At that time, many will turn away from the faith and betray and hate each other. Many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. Because of the increase in wickedness, the love of most will grow cold. But the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. It has been suggested quite strongly that when these things happen, when these things take place, and there is a massive food shortage, that global governments will have to take control of food resources, without a doubt. There won't be enough food to go around, and they will have to prioritise who that food goes to. That will lead to rationing and control measures and a new political order, shall we say. Maybe there could be the conditions to be able to get that food. Maybe we'll have to swear allegiances to get that food. The Revelation points a picture at things like that. They call it the mark of the beast, that to buy and sell goods, in other words, to trade, to have economy, to provide for yourself, you'll need to sign up to this agenda, whatever shape it is. So there's potential there to fulfill that prophecy. People will be so focused about finding food and surviving that all rational thinking will go out the window. People will betray one another to get food. People will attack one another to get food. Because of the increase in wickedness, the love of most will grow cold. Funny, actually, how it says that, isn't it? I don't think there's anything that we can allude to, but it's interesting, yeah, the love of most will grow cold. So when you see us standing in the holy place, the abomination that causes desolation, spoken through the prophet Daniel, it's Jesus alluding to Daniel's prophecies, let the reader understand that those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the housetop go down to take anything from the house. Let no one in the field go back to get their cloak. How dreadful it will be for those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Why single out pregnant women and nursing mothers? I think that's got to be one of the most horrible things to endure as a mother, to not be able to feed your child and to see your children go hungry. It's happened before, but not on the scale that's coming. Pray that your flight will not take place in winter. I remember a brother from Broadstone, Brother John Gentle, was adamant that no word in Scripture is put there just to pad things out. It's put there for a reason. Pray that your flight will not take in winter. Winter's going to be a problem, or on the Sabbath. For then there will be great distress, unequal from the beginning of the world until now, never to be equalled again. If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. We've often alluded nuclear war to this, other wars, and I'm sure there will be wars. But what about famine? What about food shortages? It would be so bad that if God didn't intervene, all would perish. But understand this. If the owner of the house had known at what time, and these teachings of Jesus followed straight after the prophecies that he gave, the Olivet prophecies about the time of the end. Understand this, if the owner of the house had known what time the night the thief was coming, he would have kept watch and would not let his house be broken into. So you must also be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him. People will be so focused on surviving, they will be not watching, they won't be watching the other signs that will be happening in the Middle East. They won't be interested because they'll be so focused on surviving. And I believe it would be our job, if we're here, to warn and remind as many as we can of what's happening in the world, particularly what will be happening in the Middle East, possibly at the same time, to save others. We can't do that if we're not fit and able to do that. So we prepare not to save ourselves, we prepare so we can be fit and able to preach to others. This absolutely amazed me when I read this. I've read this so many times because I'm particularly interested in end-time events, and yet this just leapt off the page. Who then is the faithful and wise servant whom the master has put in charge of the servants in his household, to give them food at the proper time? It will be good for that servant whose master finds him doing so when he returns. Truly I tell you, he will put him in charge of all his possessions. Now, whether you take that as spiritual food or physical food, I just find it amazing that after all these prophecies that Jesus tells us, he uses food as an instruction to draw attention to it in these times when he returns. Food at the proper time. And there'll be blessings if we're trying to help others. Examples of practical preparation before God's intervention. Noah prepared provisions for the ark. Joseph stored food before 7 years of famine so he could help the nation. Israelites prepared food before Passover, before they were taken out of Egypt. They were told to prepare food. The Israelites had to store additional manna before the Sabbath. On the sixth day, they had to take double portions with them. 5 wise bridesmaids stored additional oil so that they could be truly ready and focused to witness the return of Jesus. Now, there are many lessons in that teaching that Jesus gave. Most people think oil is faith, and it quite It can quite literally be faith. However, there is a slight problem with that because the foolish virgins were told to go and buy oil. You can't buy faith. It's about being prepared, being ready, being alert, looking for the signs of Jesus' return so we're ready. And as Jesus, as we just read in Matthew 24, blessings for those who provide food at his time, both spiritual, I believe, and physical. Proverbs tells us, be ants, not locusts. Take the lesson from the ants, you lazy bones. Learn from their ways and become wise. Though they have no prince or governor or ruler to make them work, they labour hard all summer, gathering food for the winter. Interesting, isn't it? With this in mind. Well, let's end on a positive note. Thankfully, we've got a wonderful hope, haven't we? We've got the promise that, yes, difficult times will lie ahead, but there's a great ending, isn't there, for those who put their faith in God and the Lord Jesus. Here we have in Revelation, talking of this time when Jesus gathers those that follow him, that put their trust in him. Then one of the elders asked me, these in white robes, who are they? Where did they come from? These are people with Jesus. I answered, sir, you know. He said, these are they who have come out of the great tribulation. This is the period, Daniel 70th week, the period Jesus was talking about. There's never been before. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Therefore, they are before the throne of God and serve him day and night in his temple, and he who sits on the throne will shelter them with his presence. So the Lord Jesus. Verse 16. Never again will they hunger. Never again will they thirst. Interesting, isn't it? So ultimately, whatever happens, and we certainly can't rely on our own strength to get us through this difficult period, but there are things we can do to save others. But ultimately, Jesus and his return is the solution.